Hello and welcome to the second part of the Memory and Eyewitness Testimony Explain Everything. So in this Explain Everything, I'm going to be talking about things like the forgetting curve, false memories, reconstructive memory, including Loftus and Palmer's research on that particular concept. And we're looking at improving memory, so things like context and state-dependent cues and mnemonic devices. The third part of this Explain Everything will be made by Amanda, and that should be out next week at some time. Okay, so the first section is about eyewitness testimonies. So eyewitness testimonies involves a statement from an individual who has viewed an event, and they are giving their personal account of that event. The thing for kids to know and understand is that 70% of convictions in the USA were overturned through DNA testing, and they were a result of faulty eyewitness identification. There are many reasons why eyewitness testimony fails. The experience of the crime tends to be brief, so eyewitnesses only see the criminal for a few seconds or thereabouts. There tends to be poor viewing conditions, so it might be in shadow, dim light, they might see the criminal from the distance, or they're obscured. It's emotional, so stressful situations affect our encoding and consolidation of information. And lastly, our experience can be influenced by expectations. So we tend to build on our own expectations created by similar experiences from the past, from things like stories, films, TV, or even your own feelings at the time. So false memories. Research indicates that gaps in memories are common and often filled by logic, guessing, or new information that has been introduced. Now that new information will become very important later on. This can actually lead to a false memory. A false memory is a fabricated or distorted recollection of an event. They tend to be a common problem in police work. False memories are relatively common, and there have been many studies done on actually planting false memories. There's a really good article that you can read in the Jack Randa textbook for 3-4 psychology. So if you're interested in reading more about that and more explicitly the experiments that they've done on planting false memories, then shoot me or Amanda an email and we can send that your way. So in the context of false memories and police work, a witness may identify a suspect in a police lineup because they saw an image of the person on a TV rather than actually remembering from the scene of the crime. To demonstrate this activity, there's an activity on Teams that you can do. It's called Introductory Experiment. You need to make sure that you do this activity before you start teaching the content. And so what you're going to do is you're going to show the kids a list of words that will be displayed. And so the PowerPoint will automatically move through the words on the list. At the conclusion of the experiment, there will be a link to false memories. You can also watch Lost in the Mall, which is also linked in the kids' booklet, and that's a really, really good little clip showing how false memories can be implanted into people's minds. The article that I was talking about before, that is related to that particular clip. So here's a prime example of how false memories can lead to incorrect or inconclusive eyewitness testimonies. So this is a case study of mistaken identity, and I'll leave you to read through this yourself. But again, these cases are not actually very uncommon, unfortunately. And as I said before, over 75% of cases in the USA have been overturned because eyewitness testimony has been what we call fallible. Before you start teaching content on memory reconstruction, it's useful to revisit the first slide that you taught the kids or gave to the kids in terms of memory. So more specifically looking at why memory is considered to be more of a painting rather than a photograph. That's a really useful analogy that I use when I'm talking about memory reconstruction, because it shows the kids that when we recall information, we don't recall things as they were in reality. We recall a representation or an interpretation of that event. So that's why it's less of a photo. It's rather more than a memory. The other thing to understand is that when we recall information, our brain actively reconstructs the memory. So what that actually means at a biological basis is that our memories are not stored in one place of our brain. In actuality, they're stored all throughout our cerebral cortex, and they're stored depending on the modality, or they're stored depending on the sensory register that the information was processed through. So for example, when your kids encode memories of you in class, the information or the memory of what you look like is stored in the visual cortex. The memory of what you sound like and the words that you're saying are stored in the auditory cortex. And so what happens when we recall information or we recall memories is that information from all over your brain is brought together like a jigsaw, and then it's recalled as a single memory or as an episode. So memory reconstruction involves combining stored information in the long-term memory with other information to form what is believed to be a coherent, complete, or accurate memory. Now, again, when we're combining information from all parts of our brain to make an episode or a memory, we actually aren't going to include every single thing that happens in that event that we're recalling. So what we actually do, and this again occurs quite a lot of the time, is we actually fill in the gaps based on lots of different factors. So based on things like our pre-existing knowledge, past experiences, psychological state, motivation, expectations, and assumptions. And what that does is it gives it a more holistic interpretation or memory of the event. So ultimately, what the kids have to understand is that when we reconstruct memory, if it has gaps in it, we tend to add information so it makes more sense to us when we're retelling a story or when we are looking for information or when we are answering questions on an exam or something like that. To demonstrate this concept, you can play the game Chinese Whispers. So I'm sure you all know that Chinese Whispers is when you whisper a sentence or a statement into somebody's ear, and then everybody goes around the room and they whisper the same sentence. And what should happen is it should change over the retellings, and the person who eventually tells this statement to the class should hopefully have a really inaccurate retelling of the statement. What I normally do, so I don't have to whisper in a kid's ear, is I normally just hand them something on a piece of paper, and it's something stupid like, I love psychology, or something relatively complex, so I know that they're going to stuff it up or change it. So after the kids finish that activity, you can ask them a few questions. So you can say, did the message change as it was passed around the room? And hopefully it did. How does it differ from reality, or does it reflect reality? And of course it doesn't reflect reality, fingers crossed. And then how is this like memory reconstruction? So it's a really simple demonstration that you can use, but it is quite effective in showing kids that what we're recalling or what's actually coming out of our minds is actually not necessarily what we're actually putting in our mind. So here's a really simple graphic that you can use to show your kids, and this is a really simplistic way to show how our memories change over time. So we can see that memories change to suit knowledge and beliefs. Incongruent details are lost, information becomes simplified, and extra detail is added. There is some really good research done by a guy called Bartlett, where he read some participants a story called The War of the Ghosts. This particular story was based on American Indian culture, and it had, phrases and storylines that were familiar and contextual to their culture. So what he had the participants do is recall the story in their own words, and what he found was that each participant changed the plot of the story, or changed the story in the sense that they changed words to words that the participants were more familiar with. They lost detail, they added an extra detail, and they otherwise reconstructed the story to make more sense to their personal narrative. If you're wanting to look at that research, again, you can just shoot me or Amanda an email and I will send it your way. So eyewitness testimonies involve a personal first-hand account from an individual who has viewed an event. However, many eyewitness testimonies demonstrate the fallibility or the unreliability of memory. Now, I've spoken about why eyewitness testimony is fallible before, but again, there are a few things that make it fallible. So there's stress, and stress can impair the encoding and consolidation of memories. The viewing conditions can normally be dim. There's inaccurate encoding or storage of the memory. And there's addition to new and possibly inaccurate information from things like revisiting the information over time, from things like leading questions or questions from police, or things like watching TV with similar events and getting them mixed up in your mind. And then the memory can fade over time, which can also affect the accuracy of the memory. The problem here, though, is that it's often used in court and juries tend to view it as a reliable source of information. Now, that's because our memory processes aren't very well understood, and again, people tend to think that what we remember is reality rather than a representation. In the last slide, I mentioned that memory can fade over time. This can be related back to the forgetting curve. So prior to teaching this content, you should have had your students memorize a bunch of nonsense syllables, and you should have had them recall the information in different intervals. If you plot the graph in terms of their results, what you should actually see, we hope, is something relatively similar to this curve here. So this is called the forgetting curve. And what it measures is the rate and amount of forgetting over time. So Ebbinghaus was a theorist who tested his retention of nonsense syllables after varying amounts of time, like your students did. And so he used his results to develop the forgetting curve. Now, if you have a look at the curve, what you can see is that we have the percentage of information retained, so from 100 to 0, and we have some intervals down below. So after 20 minutes, participants, or Ebbinghaus I should say, recalled about, that's not very good, about 60% of information. After 1 hour, he recalled about 40% of information. And after 24 hours, he recalled about 30% of information. That's not super good, but oh well, let's just go with it. And after that time, we can see that the rate and amount of forgetting becomes relatively stable. So in terms of, I guess, the trend of the graph, that we can see that in the beginning 20 minutes, there is a very steep slide or level of forgetting. Between the first 20 minutes to 8 hours, we have a slower decline of information. And then from about 24 hours, the information plateaus. So it remains relatively stable over time. From Ebbinghaus's research, we can draw a conclusion that even if we were to see a crime happening in broad daylight and we weren't super stressed and so our encoding was perfect, even if that was the case, we would actually lose the majority of our information and we would only retain really about 21% after 31 days. The thing about the forgetting curve is that this tends to occur for a wide variety of materials under many conditions. In saying that, there are two ways that we can increase the retention in terms of the forgetting curve. If the information tends to be more meaningful to somebody, then that will make the retention higher. So if there's lots of semantic connections involved, then that can help a person retain information. The other way that we can increase retention is to increase the effectiveness of the initial encoding. So again, if we do that, the better the learning, the more likely we'll retain that information over time. So we are now going to look at leading questions and the theorist who kind of talked about memory reconstruction in relation to leading questions, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Loftus. There are lots of YouTube clips that you can find, even some really good TED Talks, which will demonstrate Loftus's research. So Loftus studied leading questions and language usage during police questioning. She showed how recall does involve an active reconstruction of events, and the way that the questions are asked during eyewitness testimony can influence memory. Her research made it really clear that leading questions can be used to manipulate memory. So leading questions have content or a phrase in a way that suggests what the desired response is. So questions that sound like, "Did you see the knife?" rather than "Did you see a knife?" make a presupposition, or they suggest that there was a knife in this scenario. Another good example of a leading question might be, "How tall was the person?" Now that implies that the suspect was tall. Or for example, if you walk into your classroom, and you can maybe try this, you can say to the kids, "Oh my God, did you see the fight at recess?" Now that again suggests there was a fight, rather than saying, "Did you see a fight?" which includes no presupposition. Because leading questions do involve that suggestion, they may introduce new false information which can be integrating with the existing memory in long-term memory. Now, when that is integrated, it is stored as fact, and when the memory is reconstructed, it is likely to include the false information related to the event. Now, what you can see over here is Loftus's model of recall. Now that's a really good diagram that you can show to the kids. So what we can see here is that we've got the original experience, the integration of the information into long-term memory. We then have the integration of new information into the original experience. And so that's where storage and consolidation occurs in long-term memory. Then when a question is asked, the information is recalled with the new inaccurate information, and the person responds to the question. Now, of course, when the person responds to the question, they actually don't know what part of the memory is true or false. And that's why eyewitness testimony can be so unreliable, because you don't know where the truth starts or ends. So here's some more specific information about Loftus and Palmer's research. She actually did about 3 experiments, but you only need look at one. Loftus's aim was to investigate the effect of misleading questions and the influence of language during police questioning. So 45 volunteer students from a university where the researchers worked were shown 7 clips of car accidents. All the participants were asked a critical question. They were asked approximately how fast were the cars going when they blank each other. There were 5 conditions, and in each condition, the verb in the critical question was changed to either smashed, collided, bumped, hit, or contacted. The results found that participants' estimates of speed were influenced by how the question was asked. So you can see down here that the smashed had the more intense estimate of speed, whereas contacted had the least. So what Loftus found was that participants' memories were distorted by the verbal label that had been used to characterise the intensity of the car crash. So up here you can see that there's a link that you can show the kids based on that research. So the next little section that we're going to be looking at is enhancing memory. Now that looks more specifically at things like mnemonics, which are really fun and really useful for kids to know about, as well as context and state dependent cues, which again, very interesting, and can also be used to kind of help kids start thinking about study tips for revision and things like that. So how do we improve memory? There are lots of different ways that we can increase the likelihood of successfully storing information in long-term memory. Some methods include things like actively paying attention to information so it's moved from sensory memory into short-term memory, and that's a great tip for most kids. They need to make sure they're paying attention in class so information can actually go into their short-term memory and then hopefully into their long-term memory. They should use an effective encoding strategy like semantic encoding. And what you might say to kids is that type of encoding tends to be more effortful than something like physical encoding, but it is worth it, because what that will mean is that information will be organised really well in their long-term memory. The way they can do that is by doing things like making mind maps. Sorry about my terrible handwriting. Mind maps. By doing things like questions, and not doing things like rewriting their notes over and over again until they look perfect, or just reading over their notes. That is definitely visual encoding and not super effective. They can ensure that cues are present at retrieval that match the cues that were present during encoding the memory or learning. So things like having a scent with them when they learn and recall information, and using mnemonic devices. So more specifically, we're going to be talking about the last 2 dot points. Now, before you teach this content, there's a great Derren Brown clip that you can watch or show the kids on something called change blindness. And 1, it's fun, but 2, what it does is it demonstrates what happens when you don't pay attention to things properly. So it's a really good one to watch just for funsies, but also has a really good point behind it. So retrieval cues. Retrieval cues consist of any stimuli that assist with the memory retrieval and allow you to bring information into your conscious awareness. Essentially, what research suggests is that the more closely retrieval cues match the original learning experience, the greater the chance of recalling the information. There are 2 main types of retrieval cues that we can look at. So we have context-dependent cues and state-dependent cues. Context-dependent cues are environmental or external cues in the specific setting where a memory was formed, which acts as a retrieval cue that triggers associated memories of an event. For example, when kids learn in a classroom, Things like the smell of the classroom, the sight of the blackboard, the formation of the chairs and the tables and things like that can actually help them to retrieve information when they are recalling information for a test or an outcome or whatever. What they find, or what we find, is that when kids recall information in an environment that is dissimilar from the one that they learnt in, their recall tends to be worse. Another example is when police take victims or eyewitnesses back to the scene of the crime, so hopefully the cues in the environment will help them to retrieve information that they might not otherwise recall in other variations or other environments. State-dependent cues are cues that match a person's internal physiological or psychological state that was present when a memory was formed and act as a trigger for associated memories. So if, for example, you are drunk when you learn something, then you're maybe more likely to recall that information when again that you're drunk. Or if you are feeling physiological pain, then you might recall the last time when you felt that particular physiological pain or even psychological pain. So what I normally do with this content is I normally teach the theory and then I get the kids to apply it back to eyewitness testimony or in the context of learning or enhancing examination skills. I get the kids to think about kind of strategies that they could use when they're studying for their exams. So the last little thing that we're going to look at is mnemonic devices. A mnemonic device is any kind of technique that enhances our ability to encode and retrieve information. Mnemonics work best during encoding and are best for information that needs to be memorized but maybe not necessarily understood. They help us to organize information in long-term memory, and they therefore allow us to create more retrieval cues. They do not simplify the information, but they make it more complex so it can be more easily stored into long-term memory. They also organise information into a cohesive whole, and so when one part of the memory is recalled, the rest of it is as well. While there are many different mnemonic devices, there are only 3 that we're going to be teaching the kids. The first one is an acronym. An acronym is a word or a pronounceable syllable made up of the first letters of items that we're trying to remember. So, for example, you might get something like the acronym that's commonly used to remember the colours of the rainbow, so Roy G. Biv. Each letter acts as a retrieval cue to recall the information in the correct order. It's useful for remembering information with key words. So the thing about acronyms is that they must be a pronounceable word, so something like ANZAC, for example, or Qantas. AFL isn't actually an acronym because it's not actually a pronounceable word, it's just an abbreviation. The next one is an acrostic. An acrostic is a phrase, rhyme, or poem in which the first letter of each word serves as a cue to help you retrieve a word or idea that begins with the same letter. So this is useful when you have to remember in a sequential order. So recalling the first letter will help to retrieve the rest of the concept. Examples of acronyms are every good boy deserves fruit, or never eat shredded wheat bix, or anything like that. The last mnemonic tool that we will teach the kids is narrative chaining. So this involves linking otherwise unrelated items to one another to form a meaningful sequence or story in the order in which they occur. The more the bizarre the story, the better it will be remembered. So this is useful for remembering meaningless or ordered lists. So what you would do is you might just give kids like a list of words and you get them to make a really crazy story, and then you can test them like a day later to see if they still remember the story. So again, these are really good tools to help kids to enhance their study practices. And what I normally do is, again, I teach the content and then I get the kids to have a go at making mnemonics of different types of concepts. I also get the kids to brainstorm the kinds of things that they would use these tools for. So that is the end of the eyewitness portion and the improving memory portion. Again, if you have any questions or you want any other resources, feel free to email myself or Amanda, or even just come and see us if you want some additional help or to ask some questions and things like that. The next thing that's going to be produced, of course, is the lying stuff, and Amanda will release that relatively soon.